I smiled when I read the letter. Not a bitter smile, not the kind that comes from defeat, the kind that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't. My son thought I was just a tired old man who'd lost track of things. He thought 68 years of living had made me soft. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant in Melbourne, working with the Australian Federal Police on financial crime cases. I've seen every kind of fraud you can imagine. Shell companies, forged transfers, fabricated invoices, manipulated wills. I've sat across the table from men in expensive suits who thought they were untouchable. Every single one of them made the same mistake. They underestimated the person sitting opposite them. My son made that same mistake with me. I need to take you back about 14 months to explain how we got there. My wife, Patricia, passed away from ovarian cancer in March of 2024. We'd been married for 42 years. She was the kind of woman who kept every receipt, every letter, every document in labeled folders in a filing cabinet she'd bought from a garage sale in 1998. When she died, I inherited that filing cabinet and everything inside it. I also inherited the house in Ballarat that her parents had left her. A rental property in Bendigo we'd bought together in 2009. The business I'd built after retiring from the AFP, a small forensic consulting firm. I ran from a home office and a share portfolio that Patricia had quietly and methodically built over 20 years while I was busy with work. Our son Damien was 41. He worked in property development in Sydney. He had a good eye for deals and a worse eye for character, which is how he ended up with his business partner, a man I will call Marcus, because that was his name, and he deserves no disguise. Damien and Marcus had been working together for 3 years when Patricia died. Marcus was the kind of man who wore a watch that cost more than most people's cars and spoke about money the way some people speak about religion with complete certainty and zero humility. The first time I met him, at a dinner in Sydney about a year before Patricia's diagnosis, I noticed he never asked anyone a question about themselves. He only ever talked about what he owned, what he'd sold, what he was about to make. I remember thinking, this man is dangerous to people who want to believe in him. Damien wanted to believe in him. In the months after Patricia's funeral, Damien called more often than he had in the previous 2 years combined. I understood grief does that to people. It makes them circle back to family. I was glad for the calls. We'd talk for an hour sometimes. He'd ask about the house, about how I was managing, about the consulting work. I thought he was worried about his father. I think part of him genuinely was, but Marcus was listening too. I found that out much later. In August of 2024, I had a fall. Nothing dramatic. I stepped off the back deck, wrong, and fractured my left wrist and cracked 2 ribs. I was in Ballarat Base Hospital for 4 days. Damien drove down from Sydney. He sat with me, helped me sort out medications, spoke to the doctors. He was attentive and kind, and I was grateful. On the 3rd day, he brought a document. He said it was a medical power of attorney. He said my GP had recommended it, given my age and living alone. He said it was just a precaution. If anything happened where I couldn't make decisions, he could act on my behalf. I read it. It looked straightforward. I signed it. What I didn't read carefully enough, and this is the part that still makes my jaw tight when I think about it, was the 2nd page. The document wasn't just a medical POA. It had been modified to include financial authority. Not unlimited authority, but enough. Enough to access accounts on my behalf. Enough to act as my representative in property transactions. I didn't notice. My ribs hurt. My wrist was in a splint, and I trusted my son. That is the sentence I have had to sit with for 14 months. I trusted my son. He flew back to Sydney the next day. Over the following weeks, things felt normal. He called, we talked, I recovered. I went back to my consulting work, mostly remote now, reviewing documents, advising on investigations. By October, I was back to my full schedule. In November, a friend of mine from my AFP days, a woman named Roberta who now works in banking compliance in Brisbane, called me out of the blue. We hadn't spoken in almost 6 months. She'd heard about Patricia and wanted to check on me. We talked for a while, and then she said something that lodged in my chest like a splinter. She said, "Gerald, I hope you've got your accounts properly secured. I've been seeing a pattern lately. Adult children acting on elderly parent POAs before the parent is even fully aware of the scope. It's more common than people think." I said. I was sure I was fine. That night, I logged into my online banking for the first time in about 3 weeks. I didn't always check it frequently. The consulting income came in regularly. The property payments were automatic, and Patricia had been the one who monitored things daily. I hadn't quite gotten into her habit yet. My personal savings account, which had held just over $340,000 money from Patricia's life insurance, superannuation, and the proceeds of some shares we'd sold, showed a balance of $41,200. I read that number 4 times. Then I checked the transaction history. Over 6 weeks, between late September and early November, there had been 11 transfers, each one between $20,000 and $40,000. All of them authorized under the POA. All of them going to a single account I didn't recognize. I didn't call Damien that night. I didn't call anyone. I made a cup of tea, sat down at Patricia's filing cabinet, and pulled out the copy of the document I'd signed in the hospital. I read every word of it this time. The second page, the financial authority clause, was written in language that was technically legal, but deliberately obscure. It had been drafted by someone who knew what they were doing. My hands were steady. I want you to understand that. They were steady because I'd sat in enough interview rooms, read enough fraudulent documents, followed enough money trails, to know that the moment you let emotion take the wheel, you lose. I wasn't going to lose. The next morning, I called a solicitor I'd worked with for years, a woman named Annette Caruso in Melbourne. I told her what I'd found. She went quiet for a moment and then she said, "Don't touch anything. Don't move any money. Don't contact Damien yet. Let me make some calls." That afternoon, she called back and told me something I hadn't considered. The Bendigo rental property, which was in Patricia's name and had transferred to me upon her death, but hadn't yet been formally re-registered in my sole name due to a delay in the estate administration, had been listed for sale, privately, by an agent in Bendigo who had received instructions from someone acting on a POA. The property was worth approximately $580,000. I sat with that number. $580,000, plus the $298,800 already transferred out of my savings, nearly $880,000. Annette said she could get an injunction to halt the property sale. She said we needed to act immediately. I told her to do it. Then I called a private investigator I'd worked alongside during my AFP years, a former detective constable from Victoria Police named Stuart Parrish. I told him I needed to know everything about Marcus, where the money had gone, what Marcus and Damien had been planning, and for how long. Stuart said he'd need 2 weeks. He came back in 11 days. The account the transfers had gone to was a company account. The company was registered in Queensland. 3 months earlier, shortly after Patricia's funeral, one director was listed. It wasn't Damien's name. It was a name I didn't recognize, but Stuart had traced it to a man in his late 30s with 2 prior fraud convictions in New South Wales. A man who was a documented associate of Marcus. Marcus wasn't just Damien's business partner. He was running a systematic financial exploitation operation. Stuart had found 2 other victims, both elderly, both in regional Victoria, both with adult children and financial pressure. In each case, the pattern was the same. Build trust through the adult child. Wait for a moment of vulnerability. Draft a document. Move the money. The second thing Stewart found was harder to sit with. The text messages. Stewart had obtained through legal means I won't detail here records of communications between Damien and Marcus going back 8 months. In those messages, Marcus coached Damien on how to raise the POA, how to frame it to me, how to time it around the hospital stay. He sent Damien a template for the document. He told Damien the Bendigo property would sell within 6 weeks of listing and they needed to be ready. Damien's replies weren't enthusiastic. Some of them were hesitant. In one message he wrote, "This doesn't feel right." Marcus replied, "Your dad's going to need care eventually anyway. You're just getting ahead of it. He'll understand when the time comes." Damien wrote back, "Okay." That one word "okay" is the one that kept me up at night. Not the theft itself. That word. I met with Annette again, and we talked through the options. She was careful and thorough. She explained what charges could potentially apply: financial abuse of an elder, obtaining financial advantage by deception, misuse of a power of attorney. She was honest with me. She said the case against Marcus was strong. The case against Damien was complicated by the fact that he hadn't directly benefited, yet the money had gone to Marcus's company, not to Damien personally. I asked her, "What do I do about my son?" She said, "That's not a legal question, Gerald. That's a question only you can answer." I spent 3 days thinking about that. Patricia would have cried for a week and then forgiven him completely. I know that because I knew her. She loved Damien in the way some mothers love their children, without conditions, without ceiling, without any real accounting of who they'd become. I used to think that was her greatest gift. Watching her, watch him. I think now it was also how he learned that certain things could be overlooked. On the 4th day, I drove to Sydney. I didn't call ahead. I drove the 9 hours myself, stopped overnight in Gundagai, and arrived at Damien's apartment building in Alexandria on a Tuesday morning. I pressed the buzzer and he answered on the second ring. He said, "Dad," in the way people say a word when they're trying to figure out if they're in trouble. I said, "Come down." We sat in a café across the road. I put a folder on the table between us. Inside was a printed copy of the transaction history, a summary of Stewart's findings, and a printout of the text message exchange with Marcus. I didn't say anything. I just opened the folder and turned it so he could read it. He read for about 4 minutes. His face went through several things. First confusion, then recognition, then something that collapsed inward like a building losing its frame. He put his hand over his mouth. He said, "Dad, I said, "Don't." He stopped. I said, "I want you to listen to me now. Not as your father. As someone who has spent 31 years watching people justify to themselves why they did what they did, and watching every single one of those justifications fall apart in a courtroom." He looked at the table. I said, "Marcus has been charged before. He will be charged again. The AFP is already involved. Whether you know that or not." That was partially true. I'd made a report. It was being assessed. The only question now is what your role in those charges looks like. He started crying. Not the manipulative kind. I know what that looks like. The other kind. The kind that comes from someone who followed someone else's voice all the way to a place they never actually wanted to reach. I didn't comfort him. I said, "You are going to call your solicitor today. You are going to cooperate fully with the investigation. You are going to provide every communication, every document, every instruction Marcus gave you, and you are going to return every dollar that went from my account through that company, whether Marcus gives it back or you have to borrow it, sell something, or work it off for the rest of your working life." He nodded. I said, And then you and I will have to figure out whether there's anything left between us worth rebuilding. I don't know the answer to that right now. I'm telling you honestly. I drove back to Ballarat the next day. The AFP investigation into Marcus and his associate took 7 months to conclude. Marcus was charged with 4 counts of fraud, 2 counts of obtaining financial advantage by deception, and 1 count of elder financial abuse under Victorian legislation. His associate was charged alongside him. The company account was frozen within 10 days of my initial report. Most of the transferred funds were still in there, not yet moved on. Annette recovered $271,000 of the $298,800 transferred. The Bendigo property sale was halted by the injunction and remained in my name. Damien cooperated fully. His solicitor negotiated with prosecutors. He was not charged. His role, while knowing and deliberate, was assessed as secondary, and his cooperation was considered significant. He made a formal statement that contributed directly to the case against Marcus. The remaining $27,800, the portion that had already been distributed from the company account before the freeze, Damien repaid. It took him 11 months. He sold his car, restructured a loan, and made transfers to my account every fortnight. He never missed one. Marcus was convicted earlier this year. He received a sentence of 5 years and 3 months, with a non-parole period of 3 years. His associate received 2 years and 9 months. I read the sentencing remarks. The judge said something I wrote down and have kept. Financial abuse of elderly persons is not a lesser form of fraud. It is a deliberate exploitation of trust at its most vulnerable, and it causes harm that extends far beyond the monetary. I think about Patricia's filing cabinet a lot. I think about the fact that she had every document, every policy, every deed, every share certificate in labeled folders. I used to tease her about it, say she was preparing for a disaster that would never come. She'd say, "Gerald, you of all people should know things go wrong when no one's been paying attention." She was right. She was almost always right. Where things stand with Damien is harder to summarize. We talk. Not every week, sometimes once a fortnight, sometimes less. He asked me, about 6 months ago, whether I could forgive him. I told him I was still working on that. He said that was fair. I think it probably is. He's no longer in business with anyone. He took a salaried role with a construction company in Brisbane. He calls on my birthday, and on what would have been Patricia's birthday. He called on the anniversary of her death, and we talked for 2 hours about her. And it was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. I don't know what we are to each other now. Something. Less than we were. Possibly more than what we'd become before all this, which, if I'm truthful, had already become a kind of managed distance. I'm telling this story because of something Roberta said when I called to tell her how things had resolved. She said, "Gerald, most people in your position don't find out until the money is completely gone. You found out because you checked. That's the thing I want to leave with you. Check. Not because you assume the worst of the people you love, but because love is not the same as oversight. And trust is not the same as verification." I built a career on understanding that the most successful frauds happen inside relationships, family, businesses, close partnerships, marriages. The people who hurt us financially are almost never strangers. They are people with keys to our homes and access to our lives. People we've shared meals with. People who know which version of us is most likely to say yes. If you have elderly parents, talk to them about their accounts. Not to manage those accounts, to know what's in them. Help them understand what a power of attorney actually means before they sign one. Read the document yourself. If a document seems rushed, if someone is presenting it at a moment of stress or illness or grief, if you are the elderly parent, I know it feels uncomfortable to treat the people you raised as potential risks. It felt that way to me, too. But protecting yourself is not an act of suspicion. It is an act of dignity. You spent your life building what you have. You are allowed to protect it. And if you are somewhere in Damien's position, being guided by someone you respect towards something you know, somewhere underneath it isn't right. I want to say this directly. That voice you're ignoring is not weakness. It's the part of you that's still intact. Listen to it while you still can, because the moment you write back okay to someone who is asking you to cross a line, you have already started becoming someone you will have to explain to the people you love most. I'm Gerald Whitmore. I'm 68 years old. I live in a house in Ballarat with a filing cabinet that has every document I own, labeled in my late wife's handwriting. I check my accounts every 3 days. I have a solicitor on retainer and a friend at the AFP I call once a month for no reason other than to stay connected to the world I came from. And I laughed when I read that letter. The one from the court confirming Marcus's conviction, because I remembered sitting in that hospital bed with my wrist in a splint, trusting my son, thinking, at least he came. I laughed because Patricia would have said, "You always were too slow with the filing, Gerald." She would have been right about that too.